The building behind me is Fraunces Tavern, which a lot of people think is one of the oldest buildings in this area, but in fact this building is a 1907 replica of the original Fraunces Tavern that was built here in the 18th century. It actually originally was the Delancey Mansion, bought by Stephen Delancey in the early 18th century, and then in 1762 Sam Fraunces, who was a tavern keeper, purchased the building and opened it as the Queen's Head Tavern. This was a really important site, as many taverns were, in the building of the American Revolution. So it is for certain, actually we know, that Alexander Hamilton spent some time here. This is actually a site that we know that George Washington spent some time here. George Washington probably slept here. And in fact, Sam Fraunces had a long and personal relationship with George Washington. He became Washington's steward and cook, chef, when Washington lived in New York. Now, taverns, like the coffee houses, were very important in the planning of the Revolution, in dissemination of information in the 18th century. These were really important gathering places where people came together. News traveled very slowly in the 18th century. The best way to get news of what was happening elsewhere in the colonies or in Britain or in the West Indies was by people who came from there, and they would gather together in the taverns. It was a really important public space of the public culture of the 18th century in terms of bringing people together, again, disseminating information. Newspapers, people didn't necessarily have a subscription to the newspaper. They would be read here, but newspapers were not so much for political news as they were for economic news, and so political discussions really took place in taverns among men largely, although women also were involved in tavern life. There were some famous women tavern keepers, sometimes the widows of the original tavern keeper. By the middle of the 19th century, taverns were really starting to get a hierarchy of taverns in New York. And you had taverns for working men, taverns for artisans, you had elite taverns, and Fraunces Tavern was really in that model. He was really trying to appeal to more of an elite clientele. He was really known for his food, which was not the case in a lot of the taverns, but Fraunces was a very good cook. He came from the West Indies. He was African American or of African descent, and one of his nicknames was Black Sam, and he was a really important figure in terms of the Patriot movement because his tavern really hosted a lot of the Sons of Liberty meetings, and as I said, he was a friend of George Washington's. After the British occupation, which took place during the whole entire war, Washington came through in the early 1780s on Evacuation Day in 1783, and he marched down through Manhattan, and he ended his march here at Fraunces Tavern. And he had a big toast, a salute to his officers, to bid them thanks and farewell in the long room at Fraunces Tavern, and then he got on a boat and went to retire. And of course, then he was called back into service to be the first president, which brought him back to New York. And as I mentioned, then Sam Fraunces went to work directly for George Washington. Fraunces Tavern also was the place where in 1804, it hosted events like banquets and balls, assemblies, and celebrations, and on July 4th, 1804, they hosted an event for the Society of Cincinnati, which was an organization that was formed by people like Alexander Hamilton for officers in the American Revolution. And Aaron Burr was also a member. So Hamilton and Burr sat down here and had a dinner together. Hamilton raised many toasts, making Burr feel less socially adept than Hamilton was. And this was probably their last meeting together before their final meeting on the fields of Weehawken a week later, when Burr fatally shot Hamilton in that famous duel.